And I can remember having very, very strong taste sensations whenever I heard bits of the Lord's Prayer. I can remember very specific tastes like bacon for words like trespass.
I remember telling them, about Yellow Mondays and, various things when I was younger, and I know that definitely my dad now is extremely interested in it and sort of wishes that he had it as an accountant.
There was a friend of mine at a party talking about this overlapping of the senses, and he was talking about it in regards to taking certain psychedelic substances and how they could make you see sound psychedelically and so forth. And I thought, well, that's not abnormal, that's something that is quite normal.
I used to get these tastes and flavours, and I must admit, I did mention it a couple of times to a couple of my school friends, but I just got blank stares as far as I can remember. It certainly didn't provoke any reaction, so I never used to take it any further. Apart from that, it was also natural to me. It was exactly like breathing, it didn't seem odd.
Well, synesthesia is an inherited condition with a neurological basis, which gives rise to merging of the senses. So for somebody with synesthesia, everyday activities like reading or listening to music or eating would give rise to unusual sensory experiences like colours or tastes.
My kind of synesthesia causes me to picture or imagine words and numbers and letters as sort of being inherently coloured. It depends sort of what I'm reading. If I'm reading a book, then I almost sort of see the colours of each letter on the page. I know that they're not there, but it seems as if they could be. There are some letters which seem extremely sort of strong in my mind, like the letter T is a very, very definite red. The letter F is sort of a very definite, quite bright green. The letter E is a yellow, so when they have to combine to make a whole word, then normally it's the first letter that has the most dominant shade. So the word apple would be sort of yellowy red, but not orange, definitely not orange, because the A is yellow and the double P is two strong red colours.
In theory, synesthesia can involve any two senses or any cognitive trigger and a sense. In practice, the receptive sense or the synesthetic perception is almost always visual. So for instance, you'll often get sound triggers color, smell triggers color, words trigger color, letters trigger color. Sometimes quite rarely you'll get taste as the receptive sense.
With my synesthesia, what I've got is I've actually got extra links, extra neurological links between the sound part of my brain and the taste part. So whenever I hear a sound, it sends signals up to the taste part, and so I always get a specific taste whenever I hear a sound. I've got two dogs. I've got a small one and a larger one. The larger one, when he barks, it's weak. That one, it tastes a bit like sort of like a digestive biscuit. But it's when the small one barks, it makes me laugh because it gives me a lovely taste of thick custard. So I get a splodge of thick custard whenever I hear my dog bark. The best way to describe what's happening is it's like an eyedropper with taste on my tongue. So it's like dropping a specific taste on a specific area, because it can be at the front, it can be at the back. And it's a little like a neon light, where you have the neon light goes on, and then when you turn it off, it fades away like that. And the taste sensations are like that. They go wham, then they fade away, then another one, then it fades away, then another one. Every taste I get does have a texture. I get runny tastes, they have temperatures as well. I mean, I get things that are cold. My mother, for example, tastes of extremely cold ice cream.
I would guess that I experienced synesthesia my entire life, though I don't remember before the age of probably 4 or 5, but it's something that's always been there. And I guess when I was younger, I always imagined that the synesthesia was just the way everyone experienced things. I experience form sound synesthesia, where certain sounds and music, some kinds of music, would produce a sense of a shape from either internally, but at times expanding outside of my body, usually in the space around my head, so sort of a peripheral thing. It's quite a bizarre thing, because it's anytime we think of a shape, we think, oh, you can see a shape. It's this way, right? But the shape is there almost like an invisible plasma of sorts. It's moving. So I can feel the shape there, and it moves, and I can sense that shape moving, although I don't necessarily see it. And I get a sense of color.
In effect, there's sort of two major theories about the origins of synesthesia. One holds that we're all born synesthetic, and it is true that babies are born with an excess of neural connections. And you have, during the first year of life, there's a massive pruning back of unused neural connections. And some people hold with the theory that synesthetes retain connections that non-synesthetes do not. And that's what causes synesthesia.
When you're born, you undergo a process called apoptosis, which is the gradual shrinking of the neural connections in the brain. So you start out as a baby with many more connections than you need, and as you get older, you work out what you're going to need from your environment. So, the classic example is that the Japanese can't tell the difference between R and L usually, because they don't hear that difference in their own language as babies. So they lose that neural connection which would allow them to distinguish between the two sounds. You undergo this process of apoptosis, and some people have argued that that is the point at which you lose the possible connections between different parts of your brain. So the argument is basically that all babies are synesthetic and they gradually lose it as they get older.
The second theory is that these connections aren't just in synesthete. It's not a matter of you keep them or you don't, that we all have them, and it's a matter of them being disinhibited in synesthetes.
The same connections as the average person, but what we would call disinhibited connections. So if you imagine, for example, a bridge being a pathway, and imagine lots and lots of people trying to, blocking the bridge, you could imagine that every person has pathways that are blocked, but a synesthete would have free pathways through which you could, messages could travel more freely.
These people feel that the major piece of evidence for that is the fact that, for instance, if you ingest LSD, you can experience a synesthesia-like experience.
LSD can trigger synesthetic experiences, mescaline, a range of different substances that we would call, mind-altering. Quite often they trigger different types of synesthesia. The kind of synesthesia you would get temporarily from drug use is kind of more sensory, so the sense of sound triggering the sense of sight. But the kind of synesthesias you get developmental are more cognitive.
My personal take on it is that the two are not mutually exclusive, is that synesthetes may have more connections, but obviously synesthesia is derived from things which are common to all of us, as we can tell from looking at the patterns in synesthetic perception. For instance, both synesthetes and non-synesthetes will say that a high-pitched sound is small and bright, and a low-pitched sound is large and dark. So that's obviously a continuum which exists in both synesthetes and non-synesthetes. So I think that there may be something to the disinhibition theory, in that there is some disinhibition of some connections that exist in all of us, but there may also be extra connectivity. It's not as if it has to be one or the other.
When I approach junctions, where there's lots of written information. I mean, if I start reading it, it's the same old problem. All I get is taste. It confuses me. I mean, trying to understand where you are and then trying to work out where you've got to go with all the tastes and the fact that you're lost anyway, it's one thing too many for me. I mean, I get a funny one here, a bit like caramel and peanuts. It's totally bizarre. Colours of cars have tastes as well. Red is like stuff you get at the bottom of jam jars, that horrible gooey stuff. White, for some reason, gives me a taste of, quite strong taste of, a bit like, you know, that Marmite taste again, that savoury taste. I love blue cars because they give me a nice, what I think is a soothing, it's like ink. I don't know why ink could be soothing, but I find it very nice. It's not the actual taste, it's the strength of it that I find difficult to deal with. Some names are so strong they just stop me in my tracks. Others I like because they taste nice. Others taste horrible. I mean, I've got a friend who tastes like, the only way I can describe it is sweaty feet. It's a taste that I can only describe as being like eating what I'd imagine eating a sweaty foot would be like. People do notice when their name tastes horrible, because I can't hide it, because it's just an automatic reaction. It's a bit like sucking on a lemon, isn't it? I mean, you go, It happens all the time. There are words I'd rather people didn't use in my company, but I can't go around imposing rules like that. I'll tell you one word I absolutely detest, and that's cook. Ooh.
What does it taste like?
Oh, those things. It's again, it's very strong. That's the point to make. It's very, very strong, but it tastes like. Ooh, you know when you get a pan, you get bits of crusty, burnt on. Oh, that's what it tastes. It tastes like the crusty, burnt on bits of a pan. Absolutely disgusting.
I'm actively using my synesthesia to create artwork. I'm observing this experience I have to create artwork. If I didn't experience synesthesia to the extent that I do, my artwork would be very different. I don't know if it would be any better or any worse. I would probably be focusing on something else, and my way of perceiving the world would be slightly different, so it would be slightly different.
These paintings take me a surprisingly long time partially because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and also because I've just complicated it for myself.
At the school, when you had a birthday, they used to have a party for you in the mornings. You used to have to go up on stage. They'd give you a little badge, and I can remember my badge. It was a blue badge, a really big blue badge, and it tasted lovely. The colour actually tasted of a bit like an opal fruit, which is a chewy sweet, and it was really nice. And I can remember saying to my friend, "Look, it tastes lovely. This colour tastes really nice," but again, got no reaction, so never took it any further. Out of all the friends and girlfriends I've had, I've probably told maybe 10% of them. And in fact, the whole reason I came out in the first place, went to see doctors in the first place, was because I was explaining this to a girlfriend, and she said, "What a load of rubbish." So I actually went out of my way to try, and that's when I booked an appointment and went in. And certainly the defining moment for me was when I finally got vindicated, if you like, with fMRI scans. Very important to me, because there was something there documented by a doctor saying, yes, there's something unusual happens when you hear sounds.
When synesthetes report experiencing colours from letters, we can see in fMRI, which is a type of brain scanner, we can see that when they read letters and numbers, even when there is no colour in the environment, that they get activation in back of the brain here in the occipital lobe in an area called, say, V4, which is a part of the brain that processes colours. So in simple terms, when synesthetes read black and white letters, the colour regions of the brain light up.
I used to think that when I was a child, perhaps it was something that I had been sort of exposed to that might have caused this association with a particular colour for a particular letter or word. I think nowadays when I look back on that, I don't think there's much truth in that, because if I, for example, put it down to fridge magnets and the colours of fridge magnets, which, you know, could be sort of a worthy association to make, find me a manufacturer who makes these fridge magnets in this whole host of shades. Honestly, they are so vivid but also different from one another. They're not just sort of generic colours at all. So I'm certain that it's certainly not an association thing. There are just far too many colours and shades that I imagine. J here is correct, but T should be red. N is definitely wrong. It's sort of this colour but darker and with more green in it somehow. This S shouldn't be there either. The numbers, I can't see very many coloured numbers. This one here is actually interesting because as a 6, that's correct. As a 9, it's wrong. So it's, and yet, here we go, that's perfect. That's the colour of 9, and that's the colour of 6. But the other way around, they're completely wrong.
Synesthetes are governed quite often by very beautiful, complex mechanisms. The systems are very Byzantine and interesting, so it's not just any old letter and any old colour. It's not any old word and any old taste. You know, it's not even any old personality and any old days of the week. There are all of these underlying systems that the synesthete's not aware of, that when you study and when you analyse, you can find them, you can draw out this beautiful system.
So one of the questions people have often had is like, well, you know, synesthesia is very interesting, but, you know, how does it relate to me as a non-synesthete? Like, is there anything this can tell me about the way my brain works? And the answer is yes, because there's ample evidence that synesthesia is based on principles which are common to all of us. So if we learn about how sort of cross-modal perception works, we're looking at something that's not just present in synesthetes, we're looking at something that's present in everybody. And that it can teach us more about how we perceive the world, and also about how consciousness, or at least the neural correlates of consciousness, work.
200 years people have been studying synesthesia, and all that time people have been guesstimating, academics have been guessing how common synesthesia is. And really all of the estimates until the last sort of 5-10 years were just guesses. So, and the guesses range from everything from 1 in 5 to 1 in 250,000. So it was a huge range, and none of them were really that accurate. Then in 1996, some colleagues in Cambridge wanted to find a scientific method to find out how common synesthesia was, and it's great. Their method was to place an advert in newspapers in Cambridge, and the newspaper article described what synesthesia was, and it asked all of the synesthetes to come forward. If you read this and you have synesthesia, come and contact us. We want to find out how common it is. So I think they got something like 28 synesthetes came forward, and all of these synesthetes were independently verified. They were definitely synesthetes. And then I think the researchers did a calculation, like we found 28 people, the circulation of newspapers about 55,000, therefore synesthesia is common in about 1 in 2,000 people. So 10 years later, we tried to assess for the prevalence of synesthesia again, but we didn't rely on self-report. We didn't rely on people coming to us. We went out and we individually assessed almost 2,000 people. Every single person was individually assessed for synesthesia, and based on that slightly more robust methodology, we were able to find out that actually the prevalence of synesthesia is at least 1 in 23. It's about 4.4%.
Often I'll start out with this wonderful little portable microphone. Or a good space to do any recording is in the kitchen. I'll actually just put this here sometimes while I cook, because the sound of chopping is a wonderful sound. In particular, vegetables have different shapes. One I really like is ginger, because ginger has all these sort of fibrous hairs in it, and when you cut it, you can hear this and that creates this kind of shape that kind of breaks apart, but is still kind of whole. It has the same fibers in it in the shape itself. Another sound that I really like is the sound of the kettle. Little by little you can start to hear the water boiling, and that boiling is like this expanding, there's this sort of filament type sound at the beginning, like a stretching sound, and then it starts to expand and kind of fog a bit, and then building it kind of as it gets bigger and bigger. It almost disappears a bit because it's so big, but it's like an expanding fog, as I said. Another good sound is the pouring of wine, and the wine glasses themselves, like these kind of chiming sounds. I'll also record different kinds of sort of musical sounds. Sometimes patterns, like I said, patterns can create a sense of texture. So playing something like a simple pattern that's repeated can get a feeling of a moving texture. These kind of changing notes, the ones that you slide on a guitar or on a bass, are quite good because they change the shape of the object quite quickly. So you might have something that's like a round sort of sphere, and as it gets higher, it speeds up and gets smaller. So it speeds up, it moves away and gets smaller. So I record these things together, and then I will mix them on the computer. Let's see. What I will do is I'll take some of these sounds and put them into a sound editing. Let's see. So, for example, I've got those glasses. Because I'm focusing on the sound itself, the synesthesia is a bit amplified from the experience of actually dealing with the glasses and moving them about, because I'm thinking about the glasses, but now I'm just thinking about the sound and the sound of the clanging. But then after that I might add musical sound to it. Let's see. I'll end up with something that's, I don't think everyone would consider it to be music, but it ends up being a musical soundscape. But while I'm creating these things and editing, I draw. So quite small pieces. So I take small pieces of paper, put them on the table where I'm editing the sound, and draw. For example, this would be a texture of sort of background sound created by some musical sounds, or maybe sort of atmospheric sound as well. This is more focusing on some of the shapes and their movements. Here's one of the watercolor pieces which developed out of some of the drawings. Sometimes I play around with the shapes to try and make compositions as well, which reflect the sound piece. I'm not trying to do a scientific sort of anatomical drawing of these shapes. I'm trying to use my synesthetic experience, the experience of these shapes and the movement of these shapes, to create compositions. But while I'm editing, I'm freely exploring and finding things about these sound compositions that are enjoyable, that I find beautiful. And with the drawings, I try to explore that space, and then with these watercolors, I try to think about pictorial composition.
One of the questions was, why do we seem to see so many more of them than we saw back in 1996? And we think one of the reasons is that it's not that there are more synesthetes than there were then. There probably were the same number of synesthetes. But the reason that they're presenting so much earlier is because the modern world, the world of the 21st century, requires children to process much, much more information than they used to. And a lot of that information is being presented in a visual way over things like the internet.
One problem that I've been looking at is that children with synesthesia often have a bit of a jolt when they try to talk about it. So if you're a child telling your teacher that, could you please, that you're having trouble because the music coming from the music room next door is causing colours in front of your eyes which are blocking the blackboard. I've had reports like this from child synesthetes and parents of child synesthetes. Teachers just laughing, saying it's ridiculous, don't be silly, you're trying to get attention.
I had the opportunity of looking at old school reports from 30 years ago, and it was quite odd because all of them said that I was a daydreamer, and I can remember now why I used to daydream, because I could stare out the window and I'd get taken in with all the flavours. So it did affect my school, but again, natural as breathing, just carried on.
It's not impossible to conceive of how seeing colours every time somebody speaks could be quite distracting if you're trying to get information from a lecture. And if you see colours when you read, you might explain why some synesthetes have real difficulty taking in written information.
The breathing in colour is obviously coloured in, and apart from the B, there's not really any sort of similarity between my colours and those colours there. So that's sort of wrong. And then on the back, all the paragraphs are in colours, and that is much more difficult for me to read. It's definitely harder work, so it's just more difficult and slower to actually take in the information, because my mind is trying to almost change the colour of each word, whereas if I read something on the inside, when it's just black text on an almost white background, and in this case I would almost project my colours onto each of those words, as if each of them was just highlighted a tiny bit themselves. In this example here, 10,000 Years of Art, because even though this is black text, which is easier for me to read and to take in, as I was saying, because it's on a purple background, again, that seems to make it more difficult. And my mind on the purple background wants to make this a whitey green word, and this sort of a yellowy, reddy green kind of word as well. So even though this is actual black text, because of the purple background, that adds another level of difficulty for me. And again, with this one here, this is another good example though, because my P words are mostly red. So the fact that this is almost right makes it, there's so many P's in that word, makes it, work quite well. Whereas this example here, the Observer, that's wrong. I don't even know where to start with that. It's just very wrong. There's not one red letter in there apart from the tiny little T up there. It's difficult.
We know that synesthetes are very consistent in their associations. So if a synesthete tells you that their A is red, they will have a very specific shade of red, and it will always be that shade of red. It will have always been red, and it will always be red. So that means that you can see how consistent a synesthete is over a year or 2 years or 6 months. And what you find is that synesthetes are very consistent, but people who are not synesthetes, who are just control populations, are very inconsistent. So if you ask me the colour for the letters of the alphabet, as a non-synesthete, I might say, oh, maybe A is yellow, or maybe B is green, or maybe C is blue. But you ask me in 2 weeks' time, and I'll change my mind. But if you ask a synesthete this time next year, or this time in 30 years' time, they'll always say the same colours. So we use consistency as a method to show genuineness also.
An ex-girlfriend of mine discovered a list that I made when I was 15. We were just sitting down in a kitchen one night. She knew about the fact that I could taste things. I used to say some of her friends tasted horrible, for example. Anyway, one night, to amuse ourselves, we sat down and wrote them all down. And this was, 35 years ago. Funnily enough, it recently surfaced. And this big list came out. I sent it off to the university just to check on the consistency, and it's spot on. And that's after 35 years.
we were looking at word taste synesthetes, and the question we were asking was whether the taste was triggered by the way the word sounded or whether it was triggered by what the word meant. But it's quite hard to detach that, because if you're a taste synesthete and I say car and that triggers a taste in your mouth, it's quite hard for anyone to know whether you're actually being triggered by k, r, r, or whether you're being triggered by the notion of a vehicle. So this study here is able to pull that apart. What it does is it places synesthetes in a tip of tongue state, and tip of tongue is the familiar experience that we all have when we're searching for a word. We know the word, we know what the meaning of the word is, but we temporarily can't find the sounds of the word. Okay.
Cat. Unicorno. Ascia.
You get them on a church, like in Notre Dame. So do you know what it is?
Yes.
I bet you know the word.
Yes, it's
Do
like
you know
with G-R.
Exactly, you're in a tip of tongue state, so
Yeah.
you know it begins with a G. Yeah. Okay, so at the moment, there you go. Yeah, it's called a gargoyle in English.
Yeah.
So imagine you're a synesthete who tastes words. At the moment that you're in a tip of tongue state, you can start to taste the word, even though you can't name the word. You look at this and you say, I know what this is. I can't quite remember the name of this, but I'm tasting Dutch chocolate. And so we know if you're tasting it without having activated any of the name of the word at all, we know that you must be triggered by the meaning of the word, because at the moment that you're in a tip of tongue state, it's the meaning that you have, and you don't have the shape or the sound of the word yet.
That can be problematical, merely because some foods don't actually taste like they're called. I mean, I'll give you an example. If I see a plate of oysters, I get a very strong taste of chocolate. I don't get a taste of oysters at all. I know what oysters taste like, but I simply don't get it. I get a very strong taste of chocolate. So if I was to take that one stage further, if I was to eat an oyster, I would actually get a stronger taste of chocolate overpowering the oyster, because oysters to me are quite bland. Again, that shows that it's acting above consciousness. It's coming in, it's being registered synesthetically, and then it's moving on to wherever it goes. Because although it's a pain, I've always described it as this. It's a bit like having a filter that information has to go through before you can start dealing with it.
Okay, come inside. Okay, so this is the software that we use to assess for cross-modal associations between touch and colour. And we ran this study on over 200 non-synesthetes and on 3 synesthetes with touch-colour synesthesia. The aim of the test is to see what colours people associate with different types of texture and different types of shape and different types of hardness. So essentially we're asking whether there's any systematic touch-colour correspondence. So, okay, so it's based around this here. Bring this up here. Let's see, so the participant takes a seat and they place their hand through the blank out screen, and what they can't see is that there are an array of shapes behind the screen, and their task is to just touch the shapes one at a time. So here's a good example here, a bunch of textures and shapes. And all of the objects are given in a random order. And there are a series of objects. Some of the objects vary on their roughness, some of them vary on their roundness, and some of them vary on their hardness. So the synesthete sits here, puts their hand through, and one at a time they feel an object. And their task now is to choose a colour that seems to go best with the way this feels. It's about how it feels against your hand. So people would feel this object and then they would choose a colour. And the test moved through like this. You went on to the next item, and now you reach through again, and now you feel a different object. Maybe you feel this one here, and you think, well, maybe that feels a bit hard. Let's say that's a red colour, and it's very saturated and it's quite dark. And they move through the test in this way. And this is what we found. We found basically incredibly robust correlations. Now, if you are used to reading science graphs, these are particularly striking because the associations are so strong. But if I just translate them into English for you, we found that for non-synesthetes, smoother, softer and rounder shapes were lighter. And we also found that smoother and softer shapes were more saturated in their colour. And this is a very, very robust effect. So as things got incrementally smoother, they got incrementally lighter in colour. and as they got incrementally softer, they got incrementally lighter in colour. Very, very strong effects. So you expect that whenever you're doing a study with children and adults, that it will work very strongly for the adults and that it won't work for the children, just because of the nature of attention. We found the opposite. We found that not only could our children attend to this task, but that they were making these associations far stronger than the adults. So that's really interesting to us, because it tells us that some of these associations are not learned. It tells us that they're possibly inherited. The reason for this is that if you have a psychological process that's learned, quite often it's stronger in adults, because adults have had longer time on the earth, more time to learn. The learning is more ingrained, and so if it's a learning process, the adults show it more strongly. However, the fact that the children are showing it more strongly suggests it's not learned, and it suggests that it's somehow inherited and then dying out over time.
Well, this is the space where I do my painting with, anything that has a smell that my wife can't stand. So basically oils and so forth. I have just me and the paints and the sounds, and I just focus on what's in front of me. Occasionally someone might contact me from the outside world, but normally no. So it's quite a nice space to work in. This is Tres Elementos again, so trying to get more of a sense of the space. And also in this, one of the things I'm trying to do is get a sense of how the space moves around. So I'm sort of hoping that the viewer can feel this coming around them a bit.
To sing. Take that note. Go to sing.
This is again the one with the kettle and the cat. It's a bit darker here because later in that piece I added some deeper sounds and some more bass guitar, which added this sense. And in the drawings you don't get the full sense of the color because I'm not painting, I'm just using pen and pencil. So here I get more of a sense of sort of the color of the sound composition. This one's quite dark, it's a lot of deep sounds, a lot of prolonged deep sounds. Interestingly, there have been a lot of studies recently regarding synesthesia and creativity, and from what I understand, the findings have revealed is that there's no difference in the level of creativity between a person who experiences a high level of synesthesia and someone who doesn't really experience synesthesia. Therefore, the idea of synesthetes being more artistic and non-synesthetes being less artistic appears to be untrue, and I would totally agree with that. I believe that's untrue. I think there are some people who experience synesthesia on a very high level who are artists, and a lot of people who experience synesthesia or are synesthetes are not artists. But I think that synesthesia is a way that the brain associates different aspects of its perceptual experience and makes associations and leaps. So there's connections in the brain which don't seem obvious, and possibly on a lower level, these connections and associations and leaps that the brain makes synesthetically are an underlying factor of what creativity in itself is.
A neuropsychologist Jamie Ward and an artist Samantha Moore have collaborated together, and they've shown a link between synesthesia and art appreciation in all people. So what they had was they had a group of visual synesthetes, so they played them sounds, they played them music, and the synesthetes described their experiences, and Samantha Moore, the artist, created a visual animation of their experiences. What was really interesting is that then they took the synesthetes away and they tested a group of non-synesthetes, a group of average people, and they showed them, they played the sound and they showed them the synesthetes representations, and they asked them to rate how much they liked that combination that as an artistic experience. But they presented the visual in two ways, either exactly as the synesthete had described it, or rotated 90 degrees. So it was either exactly what a synesthete experiences or it was something different. And they found that everybody, the average person, much prefers as an artistic experience exactly what the synesthete sees compared to the one that was rotated 90 degrees. So there does seem to be a role for synesthesia in art appreciation in some way that we're just learning about now.
Human beings are creative beings. It's part of our nature. And perhaps it is synesthesia that, even if it's not conscious, that allows us this level of creativity as a species, not as individuals. Every individual's creativity will be different.
I think it's the concept of having synesthesia, if you never had it, seems very overwhelming. But you have to remember that synesthetes have had it since they were born. It's just the way that you perceive the world, and it's a little bit different, but it doesn't mean that having synesthesia dominates your entire existence.
I don't think there's any way that it affects my life that would be really that drastic. So I'd say I lead a very normal life, and it's just a nice thing to experience. And I imagine everyone has some experience that's subjective that makes them different, and this is just mine, so I'm normal because I'm abnormal.
It's such an extra layer onto everything that I do or read, or every possible thing just has a little bit extra sort of in it. As far as my mind works, I definitely wouldn't change this. I really enjoy synesthesia.
Would I like it taken away? I've thought about this quite often. No, I wouldn't like it taken away. I wouldn't want to keep tasting taste all the time, but I would be extremely frightened of what it would take away with it, because it's a fundamental part of who I am. I've always known this. I don't know what it's like to be without it. Whenever I think of things in the past, I get tastes first and everything else follows on. And if you take that away, I don't know what that would leave me with. So no, I wouldn't want it taken away. I'd like it turned down. I'd like it turned off temporarily, but I don't want it taken away.
I tell myself that I'm glad I don't have it from an objective sense, because one thing that's very common is for synesthetes to not even think twice about their experiences because they believe they're normal. Now, if you don't have those experiences, you can immediately spot what's not common. I'm using the word normal in with respect to what happens for most people. So because I don't have synesthesia, if somebody reports something, I know it's different to what I have, therefore I know it may be a type of synesthesia worth exploring. Now, if I had synesthesia and they reported this to me, how would I know whether it was unusual? How would I know whether anybody had it? So for that reason, I'm glad I don't have it, but secretly, yeah, I do have a big, sort of a very well-meaning jealousy about it. I would really like to experience it, just for a bit at least.
With your name, for example, Alessandra, that's quite nice. It's nice for a number of reasons. Number one, the tastes aren't that bad. Number two, it's pretty mild, so I can look at you and not get overwhelmed by the taste of your name. And it tastes of an odd mix of something like a lettuce leaf, some sort of weird salad leaf with some plum tomatoes. Yeah, it's quite nice, that.
What does Andres taste like?
Whereas Andres, he tastes a bit similar to yourself, but he tastes purely of tinned plum tomatoes. Nice cold tinned plum tomatoes.
And to see. Take that